All right, welcome everyone. As we're on week 5 of our study, verse by verse, through the book of Hebrews. Now, let's remind ourselves what we're holding in our hands when we hold this book of Hebrews in our hands. We said it's a sermon sort of disguised as a letter. So it looks like a letter, and it was a letter. It was sent to a group of individuals, probably around the year AD 64. And we have a pretty good idea who we think to whom it was sent. We don't know who sent it. There's different theories, but we don't know for sure who sent it. Their name isn't attached to it. Historically, various names have been attached. I kind of like the thought that Apollos wrote it myself. It sort of sounds like Apollos, and you can look him up. He was a very eloquent, intelligent communicator back in the first century that is referred to a few times in Scripture. It has the earmarks perhaps of Apollo, but we don't know. But it was written around AD 64 to a group of Messianic Jews, meaning Jewish people who had come to believe that Jesus was their Messiah, likely in Rome, and there's reasons for that. Again, week 1 we unpacked all of this. But the bottom line is that these Messianic Jews, probably a home group, probably like a life group, we would call them here at Broadway, a small group, they had regularly been meeting. They'd been Christ followers for a while now. They should be more mature than they are, but they were struggling. They were waffling. They were thinking about going back to their life in the synagogue, leaving the church and going back to full Judaism. Turning their back on Jesus as the Messiah and heading back to their old lives. And they had various reasons for that. Probably the greatest one would be the increase in persecution that was building up in Rome at that time. That's the most likely answer. And so this gentleman who knows them, has a pastor's heart for them, and he's sort of written a sermon, and now it's been written down and sent to them where he's saying, don't do it, time out. You know, he'd be slapping them if he could be there in their presence, perhaps saying, snap out of this. What are you thinking? What are you doing? Do you not realize who you're turning your back on? Do you don't realize the seriousness of the situation? So he began in chapter 1 by emphasizing the deity of Christ, meaning the divinity of Christ, the deity of Christ, the Godhood, if you will, of Christ. And he laid out this incredible list of the attributes of Jesus right off the top. It's incredible. He dives right into the deep end in Hebrews chapter 1. He says, Christ has been appointed the heir of all things. He created the universe. He's the radiance of the glory of God. He's the exact representation of his being. God's being. He sustains all things by Christ's powerful word. He provided purification for our sins. He sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. He shares the name Yahweh, according to the writer of Hebrews. He has a unique ruling relationship with the Father. Angels are commanded to worship Jesus. He'll reign over the cosmos for all eternity. That's in the first few verses of the book of Hebrews. And then week 3. He then went from talking about the deity of Christ, and he unpacked the humanity of Jesus. And he emphasized what we learned was the incarnation. Remember the word incarnation? Incarnation is how the second person of the Trinity, the Son, added a human nature to his divine nature. So like you have a soul, and that soul is embodied. You have a body. And you are a unit of a soul and body. Well, the person of the Son of God, who is spirit, not physical, added humanity to his divine nature. And he gave us reasons. We looked at 5 reasons he gave us in that 3rd week why Jesus did this. He had to share our humanity, to experience death on our behalf, to build a highway to the presence of God, to truly represent humanity, to defeat our enemy on our behalf, and to become our high priest. Last time we were together, week 4, the writer of Hebrews underlined the importance of belief and the danger of unbelief when it came to dealing with Jesus, when it comes to our response to Jesus Christ, God's unique Son. Well, today, the author is going to return to a topic that he touched on previously. He alluded to it a couple of weeks ago, and now he's going to go back to it and unpack it even further. It's an idea that would have been very important to his Hebrew audience, his Hebrew readers, the idea of Jesus being our high priest. So let's pick it up, Hebrews chapter 4, starting at verse 14. It's where we left off last week. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we don't have a high priest who's unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he didn't sin. So let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Let's pause there for a moment. So the writer reminds us, as your outline says, in verse 14, he reminds us that we have a high priest. That's your first blank. He reminds us that we have a high priest. Okay, so what was a high priest? The box teaching in your outline here. Four quick points. A high priest, first of all, number one, was the main representative between the nation and Yahweh. That was the role of the high priest, to be the mediator, the go-between between Yahweh and the nation. Okay, the main representative. Number two, a high priest role was hereditary. It was hereditary. It was hereditary, meaning like father, like son. It was passed on it was like the royal monarchy, okay? Passed on from the father to the son. It says in Exodus 29:30, this is God speaking, Aaron's sacred garments will belong to his descendants, so that they can be anointed and ordained in them. The son who succeeds him as priest and comes to the tent of meeting to minister in the holy place is to wear them 7 days. Leviticus 16:32, the priest who is anointed and ordained to succeed his father as high priest is to make atonement. He is to put on the sacred linen garments. So this was a hereditary role. It wasn't something you got voted into, okay? It was hereditary, passed on through the family. You had to be of the tribe of Levi, the family of Aaron. Thirdly, the role was usually a lifetime appointment. It was a lifetime appointment. Meaning it wasn't, okay, from your 25 to your 30, you get it, and then now your brother gets to do it for a while. No, it was usually a lifetime appointment. And number four, this high priest was the only one allowed to enter into the most holy place on the annual Day of Atonement. So this high priest was the only one allowed to enter into the Holy of Holies. So if you can think in these terms, the tabernacle in the wilderness, sort of like this, and there was a door here. So it was a tent. So these would just be walls. Let me see. See how you're getting the dimensions here? Man, I'm good at this. Okay. This is looking from up above here. And so these are kind of walls, tent, and then the door here. And there'd be an altar right here. And then there's another tent put up called the holy place. And inside this door, and there'd be curtains to cover this. Inside this door, so only the priest could go into here, and then only the priest could go into here, not just the high priest, but priest. And there was the candle here, that was like the menorah. There was a table of showbread, and there was an altar of incense. And then only once a year could only the high priest go into this place. This is the so this is the holy place. This is the holy place, and this is the Holy of Holies. And here was the Ark of the Covenant, and over which the presence of God dwelt. And only once a year could the high priest go into the Ark of Covenant to offer sacrifices on behalf of the whole nation. Only the high priest could go into here. Okay? All right. And so what does he say here? He says in verse 14a, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God. So that's number 2 in your outline. We have a uniquely powerful high priest, he's saying. Okay, as followers of Jesus, we have a high priest, but he's a uniquely powerful high priest. And the author is about to spend a great deal of time and ink showing just how unique and how powerful our high priest is. I mean, look at that phrase there. He's ascended into heaven. The author's trying to give us a visual picture of what has taken place, of the power of our high priest. Remember what we've already heard so far. Hebrews 1 verse 3, he sat down, talking about Jesus, our high priest. He sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. Hebrews 1:8, speaking of the Son, says, your throne, O God, will last forever. Speaking of the Son, your throne, O God, will last forever. Hebrews 1:13, speaking to the Son, Scripture says, the Father says, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Hebrews 2:9 speaks of Jesus, and I quote, now crowned with glory and honor. And then on ahead for a few weeks, Hebrews 12:2 speaks of Jesus, our high priest, who sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So he's saying, listen, we have a uniquely powerful high priest. Okay? He's verse 14, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, since that's true, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. So that's number 3 in your outline. The readers are encouraged to remain committed to their public confession of Jesus as the Son of God. They're encouraged to remain committed to their public confession of Jesus as the Son of God. That phrase in English, hold firmly, it's a Greek word to grasp a person or to make a very firm commitment, declaration, to sign a contract, if you will. And the author is returning to a theme that he's already introduced back in verse 6 of chapter 3. Remember Hebrews 3:6, you can turn back to it if you want, where it says, but Christ is faithful as the Son over God's house, and we are his house if indeed we hold firmly to our confidence and the hope in which we glory. So in 3:6 it was our confidence and our hope, and here in verse 14 it's the faith that we profess that we're to cling to. He's saying the same thing with different words. Now, in both instances, the author is reminding his readers to put the full weight of their faith and trust in the work of Jesus Christ. Our high priest is incredibly powerful. He sits on the throne of God. And since this is true, we have every reason to be incredibly confident that our salvation is firm and secure. Okay? That's because Jesus, and this is crucial, folks. That's because Jesus is our foundation. His works, not our own works, are our foundation. This is the theme of Hebrews to a great degree, and I hope it's the theme of your life. Your salvation does not depend upon your good deeds. It depends on his good deeds. On the Day of Atonement, Israel's salvation rested upon the performance of one person, their high priest, going into the Holy of Holies. And if he did his job okay, they got to live another year. That sacrifice was for the nation. And that's why he had bells on his clothing. So as long as they heard the bells tinkling, he was still alive. And that meant they were still alive. But if those bells stopped tinkling, that's not a good sign. Because that means he dropped dead, which means God didn't accept his sacrifice. They depended upon their high priest doing his work. And so every year they waited breathlessly, anxiously to see if God accepted the sacrifice presented by the high priest on their behalf. Every year they trusted in their high priest's ability to faithfully and truly perform his task before God. Well, our salvation is similar. We too have trusted in our high priest's ability to faithfully and truly perform his task before God. Except, unlike all previous high priests who did this year after year after year after year after century, our high priest did it once for all time. And then he sat down on the throne. And that he says this a couple times here. He's trying to make a point. He did it once, and he sat down. He's done. Mission accomplished. Keep reading, verse 15. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses. Let's pause there for a second. That's number 4. We have a uniquely powerful high priest who is able to understand what we're going through. He's able to understand what we're going through. That word empathize in English, it's sympatheo is the Greek word. You can see obviously where we get an English word from that. It means to have a fellow feeling with, to have compassion for. And weaknesses is the Greek word which means, it can mean general physical weakness or moral weakness. So that word weakness in Greek is a huge, you could drive a truck through that term. It's an all-encompassing word. It covers every area of human frailty that can be imagined or experienced. It's a huge word, okay? And Jesus, because of the incarnation, because he took on flesh, he added humanity to his divinity. Because of that, he experienced all of it. Keep reading, verse 15. For we don't have a high priest who's unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. So number 5 on your outline. We have a uniquely powerful high priest who is morally perfect. He's morally perfect. Now hear this, folks. Human frailty and human weakness are not sin. It is not a sin to be frail. It's not a sin to be weak. And as the author has just pointed out, get this, it is not a sin to be tempted. It's not a sin to be tempted. We know this because Jesus himself experienced the full weight of weakness, frailty, and temptation, yet he did not sin. He was tempted, just like us, but he did not sin. Temptation is not sin. Now, temptation can feel like sin because temptation can sometimes feel slimy. So we can feel like we've sinned just because we've been tempted to sin. But temptation is not sin. The New Testament affirms that Jesus was tempted, and it continually affirms that he was sinless. It attests to his moral purity. For example, 2 Corinthians 5:21, Paul said, God made him, speaking of Christ, who had no sin, to be sin for us. So he metaphorically became sin on the cross, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. He became sin for us, so we would become God's sinlessness. He became dirty, so we would be clean. That's what he was saying. Speaking of himself, Jesus testified, whoever speaks on their own does so to gain personal glory. But he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about him. Speaking of Christ's life in terms of a sacrificial lamb, Peter spoke of, I quote, the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. Quoting Isaiah, Peter applied the following verse to Jesus. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. Now this is Peter quoting that. Peter who lived for 3 years with Jesus. So, Peter's saying, hey, I lived with the guy for 3 years, and I was his roommate. He was sinless. Even James, just if you're in Hebrews, turn right to James. It's the very next book. It's fascinating, just one little line. The very first line of James. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. You say, well, what's so big about that? James was Jesus' brother. Jesus was the firstborn. So James was the younger brother of Jesus. I got an older brother. I'm not going to call him God. And I'm not going to be a servant. He's a good guy. But if he walked around saying, I am God, he thought he was God sometimes, but if he walked around saying he was God, I'm not joining that cult. But James said, no, I am a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, the Messiah, my brother. Fascinating. And so Peter's saying the same thing. I was with him. He was sinless. I'm telling you. Okay. But here's the question. If Jesus never sinned, can it truly be stated that he knows what it feels like to be tempted? If he never sinned, can we really say that he knows what it feels like to be tempted? Absolutely. In fact, Jesus has experienced temptation at the fullest degree possible, more than any other human being who's ever lived. You say, why is that? Well, as your outline says, only the one who has never given into temptation has felt the full strength of temptation. Only the one who has never given into temptation has felt the full strength of temptation. Only the one who has never given into temptation has felt the full strength of temptation. Think in these terms. The pressure and the weight of temptation stops the moment you give into it. You're tempted and the pressure keeps increasing until you give in and collapse, and then the temptation stops. Don't need to be tempted anymore. Mission accomplished. You've sinned. Okay? Only the one who has never given in, only the one who has never collapsed, has been on the receiving end of the full weight of temptation. Think of temptation as a shot fired at you. The tempter only runs out of bullets if the one being tempted doesn't fall. Tempter keeps shooting and shooting and shooting till he runs out of bullets. But if you fall, he doesn't have to shoot you anymore. Only the one who's never fallen gets the full weight of temptation. All right, let's keep reading. He says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Well, if sin isn't frailty, and sin isn't weakness, and sin isn't temptation, then what is sin? To sin is to respond to the weakness and the frailty and the temptation by choosing to succumb to it, by giving into it, by bowing down to it, by obeying it. That's what sin is. And our high priest never did that. He was tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Okay, let's keep reading about our incredible high priest here. Look at verse 16 of chapter 4. Let us then, since this is true, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. I don't know about you, but in my Bible, I've underlined some words there. And by the way, if you can't underline in your Bible, put it aside and buy a new Bible you can underline it. Okay? But I said, in mine, I have underlined, let us then, I underlined the word approach, and then grace with confidence. And then the phrase, receive mercy. I'm going to receive mercy and find grace. Receive mercy, find grace to help us in our time of need. When I approach God's throne, the sinless, perfect being, he's not up there going, seriously, you scummy, scuzzy little guy, you weak, frail creature, how dare you come to me in my perfection? No. What am I going to find? Am I going to find rejection? I'm going to find grace, and I'm going to receive mercy. Yeah, but that's only when you're doing well. Then you can approach his throne and you've done good things that day, and then you'll go because he's in a good mood because you did good things. No, it's to help me in my time of need. It's when I need it. It's when I've failed, when I've fallen, I'm going to receive grace and mercy. Because it's the throne of grace. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence. You know what you're going to get. It's like going to McDonald's. You go confidently because you know what you're going to get. You know? so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. As your outline says, number 6, we have a uniquely powerful high priest who provides us with continual, unquestioned, unfiltered access to the very presence of God. Continual, unquestioned, unfiltered access to the very presence of God. That word confidence literally means it's openness, freedom, bold frankness, just absolute assurance. So, as a follower of Jesus, when you approach God's throne, you can absolutely be confident about what you're going to find there, about what you're going to receive from him there. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy, find grace to help in our time of need. But the enemy, he plays with our minds. He tells us, no, you can't go to God, because if you go to God, he is going to be, well, I'm telling you, he's disappointed in you. God is so disappointed in you. He had such big hopes for you. He's given you so much, so many chances. And last time, remember what you said? I'll never do it again, God, I promised. And you did it again. So don't bother going to him. Don't bother talking to him, because he is so disappointed in you. What a lie. Did you know that it is impossible for God to be disappointed? I think I've talked about this before. What does disappointment mean? It means you had an appointment. He expected A, but he got B, so he got dissed. He is disappointed. I expected you would do this, and you've done that. You had an appointment to do this, and you didn't do it, so you are I am disappointed in you. We are not where I thought we would be. That's impossible for God. He's all-knowing. God's never up there going, I can't believe this happened. I thought the Leafs were going to win the cup last year. I was counting on it. I was cheering for them. And they once again collapsed in the first round. I am so disappointed. No, God's never disappointed. He knows the future. So when this happens, yes, this is what I expected to happen, and I'm prepared for it. I anticipated it. And I love you. God's never disgusted with you. Oh, I can't believe you did this. You pig. It's sickening. These are things we hear in our minds. It's disgusting. How can you have done that? How can you even think of coming to me with this? You make me sick. You turn my stomach. God can't be disgusted with you. Just like a surgeon is not repulsed by the sight of blood, God's not disgusted by the presence of our sin. He's quite able to deal with it. He is our high priest. He is holy. He hates sin, but he loves you. You can approach his throne of grace with confidence so that you can receive mercy and find grace to help you in your time of need. Number 7, we have a uniquely powerful high priest who will provide us all we need when we need it. He'll provide us all we need when we need it. That word time of need, in the Greek language, eukairos. There's different words for time in Greek. There's chronos. You can see that's where we get our word chronology. So chronos is the word for time, like what time is it? Oh, it's just a little past 11:15. Okay? That's the chronos time. But then there's kairos time. And this is a little word in front of it. But the root is kairos. And that is the word for time, like it's time to act. It's not chronos time. It's 11:15 time. Kairos is the opportune time, the right time, the specified time, the set-aside time, the ideal time. It's timely. That's a timely word. When someone says, that's a timely word you just gave, they're not saying, you gave that word right at the right time of the day. No, timely in the kairos sense. It's the opportune, the ideal moment for this. And that's what the Scripture uses here. He'll help us at our time of need, the moment we most need it. Okay? All right. Next, the author goes on to do a side-by-side comparison of a high priest under the old covenant of Moses versus the high priesthood of Jesus under the new covenant that Jesus inaugurated. So in the first 4 verses of chapter 5, the author describes the typical high priest. Okay, that's the next blank, the typical high priest. And the author checks off 4 quick boxes regarding the typical high priest. He says, every high priest is selected from among the people. So that's letter A. The typical high priest originates from among the people. That's A, originates from among the people. I'm going to go quickly here. And then he says the rest of verse 1, and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices. B, represents the people in matters related to God. So he originates from among the people, represents the people in matters related to God. Let's keep reading. Verse 2 and 3 of chapter 5. He's able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins, as well as for the sins of his people. So C, the typical high priest is able to deal gently with the people's weaknesses due to his own weaknesses. So he's able to deal gently with the people's weaknesses because of his own weaknesses. Verse 1 and 4 of chapter 5 says, no one takes his honor upon himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. Letter D, the typical high priest is called and appointed by God. Called and appointed by God. Okay, so that's one side of the ledger in the side-by-side comparison. Now look at, number 2 on your outline, our uniquely powerful high priest. We just saw the typical high priest. Now let's look at our uniquely powerful high priest. Let me read verses 5 to 10. In the same way, Christ didn't take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, you're my son, today I've become your father. And he says in another place, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. What's this all about? Well, our high priest, as your outline says, was appointed by God to be high priest forever. That's letter A, 2A. He was appointed by God to be high priest forever. Remember what we learned back in chapter 1, verse 5 about that, this phrase, today I become your father. As your outline says, today I become your father speaks of the assignment of a role, not the creation of a person. It's the assignment of a role. It's not the creation of a person. We took a few moments to unpack that. Showed the other 2 times in the New Testament where that phrase is quoted, Acts 13, Hebrews 5, 1 to 10, and how they had nothing to do with the creation of a person. It's about how the resurrection of Jesus positioned him for his messianic role, and in Hebrews 5, it's about how the high priesthood positioned him for his messianic role. It's the appointment of our assignment of a role, not the creation of a person. So who's this Melchizedek guy? Well, this is the first time the author introduces this name, but it's not going to be the last time you're going to hear it, trust me. In fact, unpacking the truth behind the order of Melchizedek is one of the main reasons for this sermon. In fact, it might be called Jesus and Melchizedek, as a sermon title. So was Jesus somehow physically related to Melchizedek? No. Was Melchizedek somewhere in the ancestry of Joseph and Mary? No. He wasn't. In fact, Melchizedek wasn't even a Hebrew. This is before Israel existed. Okay? Oh, so then he was a Canaanite. Okay? So what then does he have to do with anything, especially the high priesthood of Jesus? The answer to that question fascinates the author of Hebrews. He desperately wants to discuss it with his readers. He's just a little frustrated that they're not quite ready to listen. In a couple of weeks, we're going to learn all about who Melchizedek was, where he fits into ancient Hebrew history, and how Melchizedek is tied to the life and ministry of Jesus. But for now, just suffice it to say that Melchizedek was a mysterious figure in the Old Testament. Like, I've listened to literally 4 or 5 hour podcasts on Melchizedek. The guy we don't know who he was, and there's if you want to spend hours, books, reading about this guy, it's a deep bunny hole, rabbit hole to go down, trust me. But it's fascinating. But suffice it to say, he's a mysterious figure in the Old Testament that became a symbol for an eternal priesthood. Okay, so verses 5 and 6 tell us our uniquely powerful high priest was appointed by God to be a high priest forever. And the author then completes his comparison in verses 7 to 10. In that passage that we just read, we're told that our uniquely powerful high priest, as your outline says, B, was appointed in response to the quality of his life. He was appointed in response to the quality of his life. He was made perfect. Well, okay, but what does it mean that Christ was made perfect? If he's God, isn't he already perfect? Again, let's remember what we learned about this word back in verse 10 of chapter 2. We're talking about Christ being perfected. Made perfect, it's the Greek word teleo, remember, from telos. It's where we get our word telescope. It means to reach the end stage, to complete, to work through an entire process. So the author isn't talking about Christ's moral character. The author is talking about Christ's earthly mission. His mission was perfected. It was brought to completion through his suffering and his submission. So what about that phrase, learned obedience? He learned obedience. If Jesus was God, how could he learn things? And that's what the Greek word means. It's manthano. It means to increase your knowledge. So isn't part of being God, being all-knowing? What he's talking about here again is we're talking about Christ and his humanity. He increased his personal knowledge, his personal experience of obedience by continually obeying even in the midst of suffering. So as a little boy, he grew through a man, and he never sinned, so he always obeyed. So he didn't learn from his mistakes. He learned obedience by obeying, and in the midst of suffering, he became more and more familiar with obedience and the fullness of what it means to obey in every situation in life. So what the author is saying here is that in his humanity, as he walked the journey of his life and mission, Jesus grew in his personal experience of submitting to the will of the Father. He learned obedience from what he suffered, the author said. Well, what about the phrase at the end of verse 9 where it says, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him? Is he telling us that we're saved by doing good deeds? All who obey him, that's the one who are saved if you obey him, if you do good things. The only way you can get that meaning is if you ignore everything that the author has been saying beforehand, and if you ignore everything that Jesus and every other New Testament writer has told you. Think about it for a moment. What does it mean to obey him? What's the core message that Jesus left with us? What's the main call God has for his people? What has the author of Hebrews been trying to hammer home? What has he warned them about avoiding? Just in a couple verses before this. Avoid the sin of unbelief. Don't do what your ancestors did. Instead, obey Christ's call on your life. And what is Christ's call? What is Christ's command? Trust me. Obey me. Rest in me. Trust me. Believe me. Christ is the source of eternal salvation for all who trust in his saving work and not in their own deeds. Do you remember John 3:16? For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever does good deeds. No, God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. So as we conclude today, what can we take home with us? What can we apply to our daily lives here? Well, in our experience of life, in our experience of weakness and often failure, we can tend to evaluate our status with God according to our own performance. We feel that we failed God, so we fear approaching God. Don't do that. The author of Hebrews is doing everything he can to tell us that we should have absolute peace and confidence in our eternal status, in our salvation status. Why is that? It's because our eternal status has nothing to do with our own works and everything to do with Christ's work on our behalf. Okay, Darren. So does that mean that we can just sit back and coast in our life and in our faith? Next week, we get the answer to that very question as we continue in Hebrews. Okay, we got 2-3 minutes for questions. Any questions about what we've learned today? Yes?
Yeah,
The tabernacle here, yep.
I was just thinking about the high priest during Jesus' time. They were corrupt, right? So
Uh,
were they offering the sacrifices and God was accepting them?
Yes, so this is the tabernacle in the wilderness, and then there was Herod's temple in Jerusalem, where you can go with me if you want in a few weeks, and we will visit. But and yes, there were high priests there that were offering sacrifices in that temple until 70 A.D., when the Romans came and tore it down and thrust it down, and the stones were all on the ground, and you can see the stones on the ground in Jerusalem to this day. But they were, yes, God was accepting the sacrifices.
So even though they were corrupt.
Yes. Yeah. Other questions? Excuse me, ma'am? I'm not done. Excuse me? Yes.
So the only thing that Jesus did not, he wasn't from the tribe of Levi.
He wasn't from the tribe of Levi. Jesus wasn't. So he could not be an Aaronic priest. He could not be a priest.
So that's where the Melchizedek.
That's why the writer of Hebrews says, Jesus is our high priest. But I'm sure a Hebrew would say, oh, hold on, Jesus was from Judah. And you had to be from the tribe of Levi to be a priest. So how could Jesus be our high priest? He's from the order of Melchizedek. Who's Melchizedek and why does that matter? That's what the writer wants to get to. This is fascinating. His priesthood is greater than the Aaronic priesthood. And let me explain why. Yes? Was Jesus' mother from Levi? No. No. She traced back, that's why their genealogies are all in the... John the Baptist was a nephew of hers, but he wasn't a Levite. He was a prophet, but he wasn't a priest.
Do you think that Melchizedek was Jesus?
Do I think Melchizedek was Jesus? A sort of theophany? Well, we'll touch on that. You're trying to get ahead. If I say now, you won't come in a couple of weeks. I'm not going to answer you, man. I know what you're trying to do. It's not going to work. Some believe that that Melchizedek was what's called a theophany, or Jesus in the Old Testament. I personally don't think that, but some do, and you could hold that view.
Because Abraham recognized him as a priest.
Abraham recognized him as a priest of God Most High, but this is before the priesthood. So this is bizarre. Yeah, and he was a Canaanite. Yeah. And there's even more. You can go deeper into his name, and it's a name attached to a Canaanite deity. It just gets weirder and weirder. You don't want to go there. Other questions? I mean, maybe you do, actually. All right, folks. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to continue in our verse-by-verse journey through the book of Hebrew. It's fascinating. Hope you join with me again next week.